There's different levels of knowing. I think the first one is when you start to feel it internally, and you start to feel like, again, it's bleeding into all these other areas of your life, right? You can't sleep and you're just in that constant state of stress. I think another level is when people that you love or that love you start reflecting it to you and saying, hey, I'm worried about you. We miss you. You haven't been out with us. You seem really stressed. You're not sleeping, right? So your people around you are like this. You're changing, right? There's something that's really shifting in you. And again, it's that just constant. It doesn't stop. So it's not like, oh, you're stressed and then you come back down. It's just you're constant in that state. And then the last one, I think, is when hopefully you get to the point where you're like, I'm going to speak up, right? I'm going to say something to my boss, to my company, etc. And hopefully, I think for me, one of the biggest markers of whether or not you are in fact working in a toxic environment is how that conversation goes. So is that conversation met with understanding and empathy? And you know what, you're right. You've been working a lot. Why don't you take some time off? Why don't we adjust your schedule? I'm going to take this off your plate. Or is it met with a conversation of, well, that's what we expect, right? This is what you signed up for.
Raise your virtual hand if you think you've ever worked in a toxic culture or for a toxic leader. If I could see you, I imagine at least half of you have raised your hand, probably more, based on past experience and previous times I've asked that question when I can see the rest of the room. Anyway, so why is toxic culture such a common problem in businesses, in organizations, in teams? What is it about leadership that gets so difficult when it comes to managing a positive culture and maintaining, perpetuating one? My guest today is Kelsey Neff. She's an expert in exactly this kind of issue, in leadership, in culture. She's had some particular experiences of her own that has led into that interest. We'll be hearing more about that. We'll be talking about culture generally. Whose job is it even to deal with this? Is it HR? Is it leadership? Is it everyone? So we'll cover some of those questions. And the underlying theme here is what actually makes a great leader? What does that sort of person look like, sound like, in terms of how they behave, what they say, what they do? It's a big issue. It's the critical one in leadership, one might argue, and it's therefore a topic that I never get tired of talking about because it is so important and it makes such a huge impact to workplaces and businesses the world over. And Kelsey is a great person to discuss it with. So stick around, plenty to learn, and I hope you find it enjoyable as well.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Kelsey, welcome to Leading with Integrity. It's lovely to have you on the show. Looking forward to this conversation as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. I'm going to throw you in at the deep end, really, to start off. So tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your background, your career so far, what you do today, and why you do it.
Yeah, so I actually started my career in the nonprofit field. So I worked for an NGO charity that specialized in expanded learning and community development. So I worked there for about 9 years and I loved it. Honestly, it was such an amazing launching pad for an incredible career that I, am having and hopefully will still have. But I did so much work around, learning about people and learning about what motivates people and learning about how people feel appreciated and how to work with people and really what drives people. Because as we know, nobody really gets into the nonprofit space for money, for monetary gains, at least not at the ground level. So I spent about 10 years there, 9 years. And, as amazing as it was and how many opportunities I got and how much I learned, it also was really fraught with a lot of toxicity. So in nonprofits, because everybody's kind of over capacity and under resourced, there's a lot of space for, some not great business practices to come about. So I found myself the last maybe 2 or 3 years working at the company that I worked at, just constantly trying to solve problems. I just wanted to fix things, figure out how to make things better, more efficient, how to make things, easier for our employees, how to help people and support people. And I was just constantly spinning my wheels trying to make things better. Because while I believed so much in the mission of what we were doing, I always found myself saying, like, but imagine if we could just fix these things, right? If we could just do what we do better and in a more just a better way to support people, right? And to keep people safe emotionally and oftentimes physically. And so I found my last couple of years there that I just really wasn't being fulfilled in what I really feel like is my superpower, which is that, right, of identifying problems and coming up with really creative solutions to fix them. So I left in 2021 to start my own company. So now I run By Design Consulting, which is a professional consulting firm. And I like to say that we help teams work together more efficiently and leaders lead more effectively. So the goal really is to give people, figure out what the issues are within companies, give people the training, support, resources, et cetera, that they need to fix those things. Because I really believe that every single person has the divine right to work in a safe environment. And that's something that's not talked about enough or looked at enough, of how much damage can really be done in toxic work environments. So now I work with amazing companies, and we work to provide the right structures and resources for people to thrive in their work environment.
Okay. And so do you still focus on the nonprofit world, or do you work with anyone and everyone, or?
Yeah, so a lot of my clients are nonprofits because that was just kind of where my network was before. And I do, like, my heart really is still a nonprofit. I love the type of people that get involved in nonprofit because they're just driven by something so unique. They're really driven by that goal and that desire to help the world and make the world a better place. And I just love that. So I do work with quite a few nonprofits. I work with a lot of education type things. So I work with schools and different, companies that work in the education space. But I really work with everybody. So I also have a lot of clients that are startups. I love also that startup kind of mentality and the way that people are just so focused on launching and doing it the best way that they can and finding success. I love that motivation. So I do work with a little bit of everybody, but that's kind of where my niche is that nonprofit space and startup space as well.
As you were talking about sort of the small number of people, low levels of resources and loads to do, I mean, that obviously struck me. I mean, that's a startup that you're describing there as much as a non-profit. So
definitely.
And I think another commonality perhaps in those start, at least there's certainly the tech ones, definitely all those purpose-driven type companies. Again, most of the people doing those, even the people working in them, they're there for, much like a non-profit, they're there for something wider than just getting the paycheck. And I wonder if there's some root cause in that commonality around the prevalence of toxic cultures.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I never thought about that. But I bet if we looked at numbers of where we see a ton of toxic cultures, it may be really, really in those purpose-driven organizations, which is kind of sad. But yeah, that's an interesting correlation.
Yeah, or it could be because they're smaller maybe, so it's easier to notice it, or I don't know, more likely to have someone willing to talk about it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think a part of it too, I saw it in the nonprofit space a lot, is when you're a really purpose-driven organization, you kind of, when you have poor leadership, you hold that over people's heads. So you say, like, you're not here for the money, you're here for the mission, right? And you're here to do good, and this is why you get into it. And so I think it's easier to manipulate people and control people and kind of maybe socialize them into a toxic culture versus if you're an accountant, nobody's saying that, right? Like, nobody's saying, like, you're here for the purpose and to do good in the world. So I wonder if maybe that's part of it as well, is there's that motive that really people are going into those fields for impact and for purpose versus, everybody wants to make money, but that's not maybe the main motivator or driver. I wonder if that kind of leaves space for it as well.
Yeah, I mean, very possibly. I guess it's a buzzword of late, isn't it? But it's the expectation of it as well. So, like, if you're taking a job as an accountant or I don't know, in a big corporate or service industry, even, like, you're more likely to get what you expect to get when you join that sort of organization. Let's put it the nice way. Whereas in a startup, I think, and probably the same with non-profit, maybe for different reasons though, quite often what you expected it would be like when you joined is very, very different to the actual experience of working there, for whatever reason. I think maybe because some of those, certainly the smaller organizations, I think they're better at selling themselves to candidates, I think. And sometimes that comes with, misaligned expectations. Let's put it that way.
Definitely. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've sort of explored some of these concepts already, but so this problem of toxic culture, it seems to be pretty commonplace. I mean, even in the big companies, I mean, there's been some big headlines, haven't there, in recent years about things going wrong when it comes to culture in some of those organizations as well. So not just the non-profit sector or the startup industry. I mean, is it as commonplace as it seems to be, do you think? And if so, what do you think's behind that?
I think it is far too commonplace. And I think the problem is that because it's so commonplace, when you find a company that isn't toxic and is doing a really good job, that's almost like the exception to the rule, which I think is so wrong how low the bar is, right? How I think employees, especially over the last, I don't know, generations, have been socialized into accepting a really low standard in a lot of companies. And I think it's only really been the past couple of years, I think a lot in response to the Me Too movement and to Black Lives Matter and to the pandemic for sure, of people being like, you know what, I'm not gonna do this anymore. I'm not gonna put up with it anymore. And I think because of social media and because of how quickly we can get information and share experience, people are being open to the fact that it's not normal and it shouldn't be normal and that they can expect more and ask more from their employers. It's interesting every time I'm on a plane or in a cafe working or wherever, and I tell people what I do, everybody has a story. Everybody has a story, whether it's them or it's their husband or it's, their brother. Somebody has a story about working in a really, really toxic environment. And so it's just crazy how really common it is. And I think how little it's talked about. I think we're getting better about it, but we're working to understand, I think, trauma on so many different levels. And I think is going to be occupational trauma is kind of the next level that we're going to, right? Of like really the impact that toxic work environments and going through trauma at work can really have on us. And I think it's getting better. I think companies are realizing, especially, a couple of years ago, we had the Great Resignation after the pandemic when everybody was just quitting left and right, and companies were really scrambling to figure out how to get staff. I think it was the first time that the power dynamic had really shifted and companies were being asked to really look at their internal processes and how they really are treating people and how they are recruiting and retaining people and be a little bit more intentional about that. Because I think we saw that there was this power shift where employees could say, no, I'm not doing this anymore, right? I think the pandemic kind of put that mirror up to a lot of us, and definitely for me, that's when I started my company, of like, this is not how I want to spend my life working in this place where I'm really, really struggling a lot. So I think it's far too commonplace. And I think there's a lot of reasons that go into what creates a toxic culture. And I think why it's gotten so out of hand. But I think that the huge part of it is just that power struggle, right? I need to pay my bills, so I have to work at a company. And I think companies have never really been held accountable unless they have some really, really big lesson or some big incident happen. Like they're not really held accountable for creating a good experience for their employees.
Yeah. So I'm resonating with a lot of what you've just said. So for me, I think, I have a similar kind of experience or outlook on that when it comes to leadership and people getting that wrong. Like everyone has a story of a bad manager that they've worked with at some point in their career. And yet if you ask the opposite question, like tell me a story of a great manager you've worked for, most people have to, at best, they have to think about it longer before they give me an answer. But on average, most people just won't have one. And I think that's sad. That's why Leading with Integrity is here, not to plug myself again, but that's why we're here, is to flip that upside down. And then also having experienced a toxic culture as well, at least my perception of it was that it was a toxic culture. I'm always not worried, but I'm always conscious of the fact that that experience might be biasing my perspective, and I might be assuming that because I had that sort of experience that it is commonplace. And that's why I always ask questions like that is, is it as widespread as it seems to be, or is it just because of the experiences that some individuals have had and it seems worse than it is? So yeah, thank you for that answer. Yeah, it's good to have a bit of validation.
Yeah, no, and I think it's definitely commonplace, and I think it's interesting because it gets really confusing in what is a normal level of stress that we can expect at work, and what's a normal level of expectation that employers can put on us in terms of how much we're committing in terms of our livelihoods and our energy. And then what actually is a toxic environment. And that line is really, really difficult to figure out, because I do also have the opposite experience where people will talk to me about their work experiences, and I try and be supportive, but in my head I'm like, that's just kind of normal work stress. Like, that's just because it's not, I think very few people have a completely chill, no stress, no work, no trauma environment. I think that not trauma should never be normal, but there is a certain level of just normal stress, right? Of just the way that we produce and how we show up and how we contribute to society. But I think that the balance is still way heavy on the traumatic side. I think companies have far too high of expectations of what their employees should do and should produce and how they should show up, and how, when you're committing to a company, what that should look like. And I think we've swung way out of hand, especially in the States. I think there's different working cultures all over the world, which is something I'm also very interested in and currently doing some research around. But in the States, it's so much value is just put on production. It's just produce. And so we get into really, really dangerous territory when we're just demanding so much from our employees in terms of their time, energy, effort, all of those things. And people can't keep that level of performance. You're gonna burn out eventually, which I loved the series that you did on burnout too. It was great because that's such a huge thing that we're seeing, is the burnout rates are just crazy in today's work society.
Yeah, I see your point about the stress as well, though. And I agree. I think a certain level of stress can even be good because, otherwise there's no motivation to finish the job, is there? Things need to get done. That's why we're here. So I'll be interested in your perspective on where that line is between, the normal, the everyday, let's call it acceptable stress, which is maybe not the right word, but we'll go with it for now, versus where's the line where it tips over into unacceptable, traumatic, bad culture, whatever you'd like to call it, the toxicity.
Yeah, I think in what I would consider a healthy working culture, there's just the normal swings, right? So it's maybe you have like a busy time in your year, maybe, end of quarters, things get a little hectic, or you're maybe putting in a little bit more time. You have big projects, so you're putting in some more time. You're maybe feeling a little bit more stressed. There's a little bit more expectation, but then things should kind of calm down, right? There should be kind of a natural arc of like, okay, things are going to uptick a little bit, and then it's gonna calm and it's gonna settle. And I think that should be expected, right? That's a normal, healthy working environment where when you have big things, there's higher levels of stress and expectation. Not to the point where we're working 20 hours a day, right? But, a couple extra hours, even that is fine. And then the idea is like, once that stressful time has kind of passed and we're through that season, then you should come back to a natural, hopefully minimal stress environment where things do feel a little bit calmer, a little bit smoother. Maybe you're able to kind of take some time off, or you're able to work a little bit less to kind of make up for the fact that you just worked extra hours and worked at overtime, perhaps. But I think where a toxic environment kicks in, or where we see burnout happen, is we never have that downswing, right? It's just this super high level of stress and expectation and performance that is expected, right? It's just constant levels. And before you know it, it's even just becoming normalized to you, right? So it's you're not even realizing the fact that that it hasn't had that downswing, right? Because it is just your life. And I think the biggest thing too is like when when it's impacting your life outside of the office, right? So when you can't sleep, when it's on your mind, when you can't enjoy your time with your family and your friends because you're thinking about work, or you're expected to be on call, or you're, checking your phone all the time. If you can't enjoy other aspects of your life, we're only supposed to spend a third or less of our life at work. So if it's taking over more than that, if it's taking over, your whole life and your identity outside of the office, then that's a really, really bad sign. And I think a sign of a really unhealthy either work environment or relationship that you have with your job.
Yeah, as you were talking there, an example has popped into my mind actually that probably sits across all of those things and touches all of them at one point or another. And yeah, it seems like something so small and insignificant. And I think this is partly why, and it's the same is true of burnout actually, I think. So many people put up with it for so long because we don't realize until maybe years later looking back that what that was that we were feeling was burnout, or what that culture that we were putting up with was actually toxic. And that's going to lead me into another question in a minute. But so this example, years and years ago, it was one of my first jobs after uni, after college. And this seems like such a small thing, but the company paid for my mobile phone. And the given reason was, I want to be able to get hold of you anytime I need to. And here also is a Bluetooth kit for your phone, for your car as well. So even if you're driving, you can still answer my calls. And at the time, like as a young person, one of my earliest jobs, I was like, wow, this is great. I don't have to pay for my phone anymore. The company's covering it. Brilliant. But looking back, and once I'd, a decade and a bit later, I actually made the decision to take my phone number off the company contract and start paying for it myself.
Nice.
Because I had got to that point where literally it was like 1 a.m. emails and phone calls in the evening, and that naturally becomes, well, I might as well just stay in the office that long instead. And so you're working those 12-hour, 20-hour days sometimes if it was really bad. And it's impossible to de-stress when you're in that sort of situation. And yet it's something that at the start was so small, seemed like a positive, and it got blown out of all proportion, and the impact that it had. And I tell you, I slept better the week after I did that with my phone, where I started paying for it myself and just took work emails off it, turned off any notifications that were work related as soon as I was out of the office. And they probably hated it. They probably thought I was being a really bad worker by doing that. But you know what? I slept better the week after that than I had the year before doing it. So yeah, and so that leads me into the next question really, which is, what are sort of the warning signs to look out for that you are in that sort of toxic culture, and in terms of like key behaviors that might happen, and then what should people do about it? What can people do about it, do you think?
Yeah, I think definitely there's different levels of knowing. I think the first one is when you start to feel it internally, and you start to feel like, again, it's bleeding into all these other areas of your life, right? You can't sleep and you're just in that constant state of stress. I think another level is when people that you love or that love you start reflecting it to you and saying, hey, I'm worried about you. We miss you. You haven't been out with us. You seem really stressed. You're not sleeping, right? So your people around you are like this. You're changing, right? There's something that's really shifting in you. And again, it's that just constant, it doesn't stop. So it's not like, oh, you're stressed and then you come back down. It's just you're constant in that state. And then the last one, I think, is when hopefully you get to the point where you're like, I'm going to speak up, right? I'm going to say something to my boss, to my company, etc. And hopefully, I think for me, one of the biggest markers of whether or not you are in fact working in a toxic environment is how that conversation goes. So is that conversation met with understanding and empathy? And you know what, you're right, you've been working a lot. Why don't you take some time off? Why don't we adjust your schedule? I'm going to take this off your plate. Or is it met with a conversation of, well, that's what we expect, right? This is what you signed up for. This is how we work in this environment. This is our team culture, right? Of performance.
Yeah. Everyone's doing it, David. Why should we make exception for you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Heard that one. Yeah.
Or so-and-so hasn't had a vacation in months. Why should you get one? Right. It's that comparison.
Maybe we all should.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so I think depending on how that conversation goes is really when you decide what you should do. If that conversation does not go in a supportive way, if you're not met with empathy and understanding and all of those things, then for me, I think you quit. That's just because that's a huge indicator of if things get worse down the road, the chances are that conversation is just going to continue to be the same thing. And, what if something happens with your health, or what if something happens with your family's health? What if you need to take time off? Like, we have human lives and human needs outside of the office. And so if those things aren't being understood or heard by our employers, then, chances are they're never going to be in a place where they are going to hear it. And one thing that was huge for me, I think it was a post that somebody sent to me when I was working for a really toxic company, and I was just constantly hustling, trying to make it better and to improve it. And somebody sent it to me, and it said, "A toxic environment will change you faster than you're going to change it." So there's always like this expectation or this thought of like, if I just stick it out, and if I just maybe try this, or maybe if I get a different boss, it's going to be different. And leadership does have a huge part in it, but when the culture itself is already built that way, it's really hard for that one leader to make a difference. And I think like that was huge for me, of that mirror of like, oh, I'm very different. I'm a very different person than when I started at this company. And it is changing me more than, unfortunately, than I'm really having an impact here and being able to shift it. So I think if you have those kind of wake up calls, either internally that you see that, or somebody lovingly points that out to you, that your core personality is really changing. And definitely if it's impacting your physical health, for sure, right? If you are dealing with high levels of stress and anxiety, if you're not able to sleep, if you're having any kind of stress related physical, ailments, that especially if doctors are pointing that out to you, like those are huge warning signs. And the reality is, like, it's just not worth it. Even if it's your passion, even if it's like a dream job, even if it's everything that you wanted, like your life and your quality of life is not worth it. So I think I'm like way too quick to push on like, just quit, like just quit, just don't even bother. Like, I think you get to a point where it's the right time for you. I think for me, I never could have left earlier than I did, because I had to get to that point where I was like, okay, I'm really ready, and this is really it for me, and I need to move on, and I need to see what else is out there. And I've never ever talked to anybody who had that experience of working for a toxic environment and then quitting and regretting it. Everybody's like, my life is better, I'm happier, I have so much more quality of life. Never once have I heard, oh, I wish I stuck it out longer, or oh, I wish I did this, or I wish I did that differently. Because the reality is the only thing we really regret is not leaving sooner.
Yeah, me too. No, I think it is difficult, isn't it? And I think you've got to, I definitely jumped to the just quit way too quickly as well. And I think that's because, like you, it was, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it did change my life. Like, there were so many stresses on me that I didn't realize until they weren't there anymore. Mm-hmm. And even now, like a small business owner, business of one, yes, I still have stress sometimes, but I think it's mostly that healthy kind. And when it isn't, it's just one stress about one thing at a time. And that is a huge difference as well, that you don't necessarily realize again until it happens. But then I also see the other side of it. Like, it's not that easy. Mm-hmm. If you're not ready, and even if you are ready, but there's other things going on in your life that mean you need the stability, you need to be able to rely on the paycheck, you can't afford to take that risk. I do see those arguments as well. And I know, I really sympathize and I empathize with that.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think I obviously was in a very different situation, because like when you have kids, or you have a family, or you have, people that are relying on you, you have maybe family members that are relying on you. It's a very, very different situation. If you're like, I have to pay bills because people need me for food and shelter. And it's not easy. I think even if you don't have kids, even if you are just a single person, it still is just that feeling of almost like failure, right? Did I fail at this? There's also an element too of the devil, right? So even if I am so stressed and so overwhelmed and it's all of these things, at least I know this, right? I know what this stress looks like. I don't know what else is out there. I don't know what another company is going to be like. And I think that really holds people back a lot too, is even if it is horrendous and it's really impacting you in so many different ways, it's comfortable, right? You know it, and you know what to expect, and you know how to exist in that environment. So I think that there's a lot of reasons why it takes people maybe longer than they should, or longer than what would be ideal, to get to that point of being like, I'm done. I need to leave. I need to go. But I think if you do, and for me, the thing that I always come back to is usually you can go back. It's like you always know what's here, and you can go back if you maybe go and try something else and it doesn't work. You always are able to return to that environment, but nobody ever does. Because once you do make the leap, once you do find a new job, or you do your own thing, or, whatever it may be, whatever your next step may be, you realize like, oh my gosh, right? It's what you said of like, I didn't know until it was gone, how bad it was. And while I do have different stresses and there are other things on my mind, it's nothing like that level that I was really experiencing in that environment.
Yeah, I think whether or not you can go back is perhaps an open question. I think that very depends on like how toxic was it and how they react to you leaving, and how fed up you are as well, and the way that you decide to leave.
Yep, great points.
And I mean, I've seen a couple of people though where they reached that point, and rather than leave, they just checked out mentally. Like, there was their best effort was long behind them, and nobody seems to mind that. I don't know. Maybe that's just a particular example I'm thinking of, but I feel like, so from a leadership perspective, one of the things that you see quite a lot in some of the pushback in the comment sections, shall we say, is these leaders and managers kind of saying, well, it's not my problem. To start with, morally, I can't express strongly enough how much I disagree with that statement. Absolutely. It's not just your problem, it's your job.
Right.
But anyway, so even without that, it's having such a negative impact on the whole organization. Like, even if you don't see it as something you should be dealing with as a leader, if you do deal with it, I can almost guarantee that productivity will increase, because people will be less stressed, which means they're happier at work, they're more creative, they're more innovative as a result, and therefore productivity is going to go up. So it might seem like giving someone time off to de-stress is going to decrease your output, let's say, but actually in the long run, I think it increases it. And I don't understand why more leaders don't see it that way.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane to me, because it is the one principle and practice in business that literally everybody wins. So when you really invest in leadership development, and you invest in creating a healthy culture, and you invest in team dynamics, we have so much data and evidence that business skyrockets. So even though there is maybe an investment, even though there is, and I would even argue the investment isn't monetarily, it's the development piece that leaders need to go through and companies need to go through. And that is hard, right? Because you do have to face your ego, and you have to be willing to try different things and be really humble. And that's, I think, a price that a lot of companies don't want to pay, which is unfortunate. But yeah, we have so much data that productivity increases, call outs decrease, right? We see people stay in companies longer, which we know is profitable for businesses. It takes, I'm trying to remember the exact figure, but I think it takes 2 to 3 times an employee's salary to replace them. So if you are talking about the bottom line, leadership development and company culture development has so many monetary gains, other than the fact that it's just the right thing to do for your team. And morally, it's what every company should be focused on. You will see your business improve and thrive if you develop your people, and if you really invest in creating an environment for them where they do feel safe and they do want to work at and give their best, right? So when you provide the best for people, people will return with the best. They'll want to show up as the best. And I actually just finished one of the best books on company culture I've ever read, which is called Employalty by Joe Moll. It's incredible. But he talks about how there's this idea that if you pay people higher than you think is fair, or if you invest monetarily in them in a lot of ways, then people are just going to take, right? They're going to take that, and they're going to maybe not show up to the level that you want them to. And there's so much research that shows that people actually just match that. They want to feel like they're being compensated fairly, but they also want to earn that compensation fairly. So if you show up in ways that you're really supporting them both monetarily and through their experience working for you, they'll show up and they'll perform in the way that's going to make your business skyrocket. So it's just insane to me when leaders and companies kind of keep their head in the sand when it comes to these things, because there's so much data and experience that we can talk about when it comes to the benefits, both monetarily and just environmentally, that people will have and companies will have when they look at these things.
Yeah, so that whole like the pay and the reward this conversation, I find it quite fascinating. Like, because I mean, the way it's traditionally worked, it's all down to the employer to decide. Some of the best ones, they'll go and do market benchmarking and see what they consider as a market fair price for that particular job. Most don't. It will just be, what can we afford? That's what we'll offer. Take it or leave it. Which again, like, I can see a logic to that at least, because there's no sense spending more than the business can afford, because then you're going to go out of business anyway. So, but it is a difficult one. And then the example I always find really interesting was that company. I cannot remember the name of it. There's probably a few more that have followed on since, but it was maybe, I think it was pre-COVID just about, but they started paying everyone the same. So the whole company was on something like 70K, I think it was at the time, in dollars. Which I'd love to know what happened afterwards. I keep meaning to go back and research that again, because that's going to have different impacts on different parts of that business. There's people there who probably think they're worth more than that, who are going to work less. There's people there, like the example you've given, who don't feel like they're anywhere near worth that much in terms of their experience. So they're either going to feel so daunted by it, they leave. Or they're going to, maybe if they're perhaps not as morally righteous as everyone else, they might just take it and keep quiet. Or the third category, I guess, is the ones you were talking about, where they'll work so hard to try and feel like they're worthy of that much money. And I think that the interesting part of this whole conversation to me is how we value employees. Is it about the value they give to the business? So what's the output worth to the company? Is it just a time versus money equation, which it has been historically in pretty much every corporation or company ever? That I would say is the norm. Or is there some other way? Like, should we be redefining productivity in some other way? And I have no idea what that looks like. I just find it, really fascinating.
Yeah, I'm so happy, and I hope it continues, this trend that like we're getting away from the exchange of just time for money, because it's really not beneficial for either side. It's, because it's not always equitable in that way. You have busy seasons and you have light seasons, and there should, again, hopefully should be that natural swing of things. And so just saying, okay, you're going to show up from this time to this time, and I'm going to pay you this amount, regardless of how you produce and what you produce and all of those things, it's just insane to me. I think that the more we kind of get towards that gig economy model, right, if I'm going to pay for just you to do this project, I think is great, because it gives more power and control to employees to kind of dictate their time, right? And I think one of the best things about the pandemic is it showed us that we could do that. It showed us that because virtually every company in the world had to shift to a remote model, we saw that like people can work whenever they want to, theoretically, right? If everything is kind of, or most things are online. And of course it doesn't work for everything. Obviously your doctor can't do that. Obviously a lot of service jobs can't do that. But thinking about like there are ways that we can incorporate that for sure. And really giving people the autonomy to, for me, it's like I'm a night owl. So sometimes I get really creative at like midnight and it was frustrating when I'm in a job where I'm just exchange time for money, because that means that I don't get to work at the times when I feel the most productive or creative or whatever that may be. And the value exchange, is just so simplistic, when I think we can really be more creative with how we're allowing people to kind of show up and do their jobs. And I think when you give people that autonomy, you get better results, because if people feel more free and more flexible to work how they want to work, then you're going to get better work from them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd love, I don't know if there is a study out there, but I would love to see one looking at the actual value and the return on investment in this kind of arena, if you like, because I feel like that traditional model that so many companies stick to because they feel that that's the way they're maximizing value. I think actually the opposite is true. I think because they're forcing it, the level of productivity they're achieving there is probably costing them money and always has been.
Definitely.
And I think if that study existed and more companies were aware of it, I think that overnight we would see that change across entire industries, because suddenly they'll wake up to it and they would like, it's the bottom line that matters to this kind of mentality, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and we even look at, just the movement toward the 4-day work week, which I think that, you guys in the UK and in most places in Europe, I think have way more advanced ideas in terms of like time that you're expected to be at work and performing, and obviously not true of every industry for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say it varies massively.
Yeah. You're like, maybe not so much.
There are some that are really forward looking and have moved to it pretty much already. And there's others who are just digging their heels in.
Yeah, but that movement is fascinating to me because we look at it just in black and white and you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. If people are working less, how is productivity skyrocketing? But if you think about just the amount of time at work that is wasted because you have, you're chatting by the water cooler and then you're having this conversation and you're kind of just like lounging around because there's not much to do. And there's so much time at work. Like when I worked in the nonprofit space, that's such an interesting industry because so much of it is just so heavy on relationships, which is true, I think, of every industry. But in the nonprofit space, there was a lot of time just spent talking, so much time talking. And especially in those leadership positions, it's like you're constantly just listening to people and having those conversations. And so I remember it was like my whole day was spent talking. And then I would actually do like my work after hours, right? So after everybody else had gone home, then I would be like, okay, I have 100 emails I have to respond to, and I have all these grant deadlines that I have to figure out. And so if we look at that in terms of the 4-day work week model, if I know I only have this amount of time to get these things done, people are going to be more productive, right? They're going to have way less of that wasted time because they know that they have less time to get their job done.
Yeah, no, you ring bells for me there again as well. Don't get me started on meetings. Honestly, I think they are the biggest productivity and just money drain, frankly, that any business has. I was talking to someone last month, I think it was, and he made a very great point that it never occurred to me. Like, I've always hated meetings just as a cultural thing. The way they're usually done in most businesses, they're a time drain. You don't achieve anything in them. You just sat in a room either talking or having to listen to someone else talk. But he was like, well, so if you've got 10 people in there, the amount of time they spent in that meeting's cost you literally thousands. Mm-hmm. And I'd never done the maths before. I wish I had. I don't know why that didn't occur to me. It's so obvious, isn't it? But anyway, yeah. So, I mean, we think about productivity, and if you like going into just the definition of the word, it's output versus time spent, isn't it? And I think the problem is with this current model, and I agree with you. I think a lot of companies, even industries, are moving away from it because I think they're starting to recognize this. If the output remains the same and all you're doing is giving a larger time block, then of course productivity is terrible. Mm-hmm. But if you can reduce that amount of time but the output stays the same, then that means more productivity. Like, by definition, that's what that is. And again, like, it feels obvious, doesn't it? So why wasn't this changing 20, 30 years ago? And the only thing I can think of is what you mentioned earlier, is ego. It's the leaders. It's got to have people around because, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it's ego. I worked for a leader once who was just a supremely lonely person. He had no life outside of work. And so, yeah, it was really sad. But he expected us to just entertain him, basically. And he wanted us to stay at work and wanted us to, talk to him and spend all this time connecting with him because that was all he had. And so that's where I think there is a dangerous slope too, as leaders, of that you have to have good boundaries in terms of how you're expecting people to interact with you and those relationships you're expecting to have. So I do think it's ego. I also think it's just the status quo, right? This is just how society is built. And I think before we had the tech boom, right, before we had really digital work, it also was like, that was just how society was structured, right? We have these working hours. This is when people are at work. This is when people are at home. So I think there is just generations of an established precedent in terms of this is what work looks like. This is what it is. And we've never had the tools that we now have to be able to produce things and to do our work and get it done in really creative ways. So I think it's with the tech boom, with remote work, with everything that has shifted really drastically in the last couple of years, I think we're just creating space for like the new generation of work and what that can look like for people. And I think it's beautiful because there's way more emphasis put on individual autonomy and on time autonomy and freedom with that, right? And I think it's shifting a lot in terms of your boss shouldn't necessarily have complete control over, like you said, like your boss should not be able to get a hold of you 24 hours a day. That's wrong. Like they don't pay you to have that much control over your entire life, right? So I think it's really shifting in a good way, and I'm happy to see it.
I think that one thought he did pay me exactly for that. Anyway,
ego, right? Ego.
Yeah. So I think we're maybe being a little bit unfair to a lot of leaders in the world, aren't we? But I think one, and you've mentioned it there. I think there's the wider culture than individual organisations in there. There's social culture, there's the working culture, there's industry cultures as well. And I think a lot of leaders in these situations, a lot of managers, even CEOs, founders, all of the above, they're not doing it, most of this, with a few exceptions. They're not doing this maliciously. They're not doing it because they're just really mercenary and they're really trying to grind as much out of you as they can for their money that they're being forced to spend on you. I think it is so much of it is unconscious, a lot of it. Mm-hmm. It's the working culture that they've been brought up on as they've come through the workforce themselves. It's the norm. It's like you say, it is the norm. This is just the way it's always been done. And I think it takes a real certain type of visionary or rebellious streak in a leader to try and break that mold. Mm-hmm. And even if they have that, the chances of them being able to do it, again, the example you gave earlier, the odds of an individual leader, any individual within a culture like that, being able to change it are so low, unless they are literally like the owner and CEO of the whole company. And then they can, of course, then just say, well, it's my business. This is what we're going to do. End of discussion. And again, even that can be a bit toxic if you handle it the wrong way, can't it? So and it is a minefield. So I give them a hard time sometimes, these sort of leaders, when they do behave this way. But also I understand it's not as easy as we sometimes make it out to be either. So yeah, I'm on the fence with it still. I think intent matters a lot.
Yes, definitely. I would say intent is huge, huge, huge. Leadership it's such a fascinating job because I think I honestly think it's one of the hardest jobs in the world if you're doing it right. And I think that's really the piece, because there's not many other jobs. I mean, you could argue service organizations, but there's not many other jobs that require so much of you just as a person, right? To be able to be really emotionally intelligent and be really humble and be really open to all of these things. And because leadership is constantly surrounded by people and working with people, it's like you get triggered all the time. You get triggered in your own stuff and your own issues, and those things get brought up. And I think it can be a pretty cake job if you just don't care. But if you really care and you really want to do it right and you really want to be a good leader, it's hard. It's really, really hard. And I think that the emotional toll of being a leader and having and feeling the responsibility and wanting to do it right is heavy. It's really heavy. And that's why I say, like, I think I 100% believe that people can learn how to be a good leader. I don't think we're born with those skills. I think there's a lot of difference of opinions in the leadership world on whether or not that's true. A lot of people will say, like, no, it's you have it or you don't. I wholeheartedly disagree. I think you can really grow into it.
I'm with you there as well.
Yeah, but I do think it's a calling. I think if you want to do it right, that's something that is harder to teach, is just that motivation and that desire to want to be a good leader. That's something that I haven't really figured out where that comes from. I think sometimes people are just kind of born with that maybe desire to kind of give back to humanity, and that's just their vehicle of doing it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Again, I think there's a difference there between wanting to be in a leadership position versus wanting to be a good leader.
Yeah.
And I think, again, those two get mixed up quite a lot. So, I mean, I've seen leaders who, right from the start of their career, they were single-minded. I want to be in charge of this company. That's what I'm here to do. And they were not very good leaders as a rule. And then I've also seen people like, no, I don't want that responsibility. I don't want a leadership position. That's not what I'm here to do. I just want to keep my head down, get on my work. I'm good. I'm happy with that. And funnily enough, the best leaders I've ever met fall into that second group, which is so frustrating, isn't it? It's like, oh, you'd be so good at it. Please, please. It's a funny one. And I think if you're the sort of person who finds yourself in a leadership role, however that happens, and you don't feel that weight of responsibility, and you don't feel the need to be a good leader or to improve on your leadership skills, brutally, you shouldn't be doing that job, frankly. So, find something else to do, or just live with being bad at it and take the paycheck, and I don't know, find a way to not care about all the damage you're probably causing. I couldn't do that.
Right. Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that is both the responsibility of the individual to have that self-awareness, but also of the company to reflect that on people of like, you know what, this isn't for you. Let's find something else for you. But I think part of the problem that we get into in society and in the leadership world is that we place so much value on leadership, which is great and it's amazing. And we need to make sure that we do have value so that we do attract the right candidates. But the problem is that then people think that's the only way to success, right? The only way to be successful and to rise up in the company is to take on leadership positions. Then you do get those people that really are just there for the ambition of it and not for the service of it. And that's when I think we get really bad leaders is there's like, I heard a story from a friend of mine who was telling me that like her boss, literally they got a new boss and she flat out told them, I'm just here so that this is a sideways move for me, a lateral move for me so that I can advance. Like literally flat out told them, I don't care about you, don't care about your development, don't care about this team. It's just a career move, so don't get attached. And
I mean, at least it's honest.
At least it's honest. You know what you're getting. But I think we see that a lot. And I think oftentimes people aren't honest about it. And they have maybe the guise of wanting to be a good leader, or they kind of phone it in terms of their performance. But I think like when you're looking at your company structure, looking at can we create ways that we can pay people more and people can advance maybe that aren't necessarily leadership positions, because if people aren't committed to the human side of that leadership job to the service side, then that's, again, that really slippery slope to toxic cultures. And that creates so much damage in people when we don't have those people that are really good leaders and they're purely just doing it for the ambition.
Yeah, which is why I'm a very, very strong advocate that any application of leadership, whatever approach you think you're following, it's got to be one that puts the people first. And yeah, again, I've had arguments about that with people, but
I think it's a balance. I think it does need to, it 100% needs to be people first, but you do need to focus on results, and you do need to focus on, success in terms of whatever the company looks like, whether that's monetarily success or that's, impact or whatever it is. Getting those results, I think, is huge as a leader. And because it's interesting in the nonprofit world, it's so people forward. It's so like, all we care about is our team and all we care about is the people. But then it's like nothing happens, right? They don't advance, they don't succeed, they don't accomplish, they don't grow. And all they have is like maybe people like working there for a little bit, but when people aren't growing in their own goals, right, and they're not seeing success in what they are putting in, you can't really maintain that either. So I think it does have to be a balance. And I think when you're a solo leader at the top, it's really difficult, right? If you're able to establish a team of leaders that have different skill sets, I think that's the sweet spot for sure, because then you can get people that are really, really good at team building and people that are really, really great at, maybe DEI, or they're really, really good at building safe environments. But then you can also get the hustlers that are really, really good at, getting contracts, and they're really, really good at growing monetarily, and they're really, really good at establishing big groups of partners, right? So there's people that are really achieved on those outcomes. And there's people that are achieved on the team or people that are focused on the team. And I think when you can kind of leverage people's skill sets and build strong teams of leaders, I think that's really how you see companies skyrocket.
Yeah, I really like the team of leaders approach. And I think because it mitigates so many of those other issues that we've been talking about, because if there's not a sole decision maker, I mean, first of all, it's going to improve quality of decisions because it's not just that one voice makes the final decision kind of thing. And again, that's another area I've had arguments with people because they feel like, well, what if everyone in the group has a different opinion and they can't, nobody agrees? How do you make a decision? You've got to have that one person at the top. I disagree, but something else that's occurred to me as well. I think you're so right about the way we put that leadership thing on a pedestal of, if you don't achieve this, your career wasn't worth it. You've no value. I think what we really, and I do think this is changing, but also making leadership valuable doesn't mean non-leadership roles aren't valuable. I think that is the difference. And bearing that in mind, remembering that, I think is really important, especially for leaders. Because we do get a bit caught up in our own ideas sometimes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So in your experience then, what makes a great leader? How can you spot one?
That's a great question. I think it's a lot of things. For me, I think there's different types of leaders for sure. I think there's people that I see that have a vastly different leadership style than I do, and I still 100% will talk about how incredible they are as leaders. But for me, like, my definition of a really great leader is somebody who is able to visualize a world that's not yet realized, right? They can see some kind of outcome, they can see some kind of goal, some kind of target that we're working towards, and then they're able to really inspire other people to work towards it, right? So they're able to work with people and to make people believe and make people excited and make people want to give up their time and their energy, and they want to commit it to that cause. And you can take that across so many different things. It could be a grassroots movement, right? It could be somebody who's a really revolutionary leader. It could be a business leader. It could be, a family leader. It could be so many different things, but being able to just see that world, right? See that thing that we're trying to work towards, that we're trying to move towards. And be able to not just communicate that, but like motivate people enough that it then becomes a reality, and to be able to then look back and say, like, look at what we collectively did. But it takes that person to be able to visualize it and communicate it. And I think that's a really great leader for me, is somebody who can make that vision a reality and collectively hopefully use that for good, right? Because we can also see that as a slippery slope to some bad outcomes. And we've seen that throughout history a lot. But the idea is like using that power for good to really benefit the world and to benefit businesses and companies and movements, and be able to visualize those things and inspire others to work towards creating them.
Yes, I mean, the history point is well made. That comes up quite a lot when we talk about things like charisma and authenticity in leadership, because some of the worst leaders in history had a lot of charisma.
Yeah.
And when I say worst, I mean worst for the world. Because, there is an argument they were pretty good leaders because they got a lot of people to follow them, right? I obviously don't believe that really. But and the same with authenticity, like they weren't hiding who they were or what they believed. Anyway, we try not to go down that path.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a slippery slope of why, again, I think there's just this huge responsibility for leaders, because that intention piece is huge. If you do have that charisma, if you do have that ability to lead, you have to be so careful with what you're putting out into the world, because you can create really scary things and bad things. And there's tons of historical examples of people that I would argue were amazing leaders, but they weren't good people. And therefore we saw horrible things happen in the world.
Yeah. And I think recognition of that is why some of the more recent leadership theories have explicitly worked in that ethical morality component. Interesting. So I'm curious then, after hearing your answer to the last question, tell us the story, I guess, of your best experience of being led. Who's the best leader you've ever worked for?
So the best leader I ever worked for was also one of the most stressful leaders I've ever worked for because she was just that innovative leader. It was like everything, we never stopped. Once we achieved a goal, we're on to the next goal. It was constantly working towards building that future that only really she could see. So it was exhausting, but I learned so much. I learned so much. I grew so much. I achieved so much working for her. And she was able to really balance that with a lot of care, which was really amazing. That she did have very high expectations for us, and she expected a lot, but she also cared a lot. And there was one moment where I had just one of the worst moments of my entire professional career. I went through this really horrible experience at work, and normally I'm really good at kind of compartmentalizing those things. I'm good at showing up in my workspace and pushing everything to the side and being like, okay, we're going to get done what we need to get done. And after it kind of settled from this incident, I still was just really impacted by it and was really struggling a lot. And there was one day we were in a meeting, and I think she could just tell that I was just not doing good. And so she pulled me outside, and she just sent me home, and she was like, you take some time. Like, it's been a lot and you need some time. And I never would have asked for that, because I was in that place of like, no, we got to fix it. We got to respond. And I can't, right now is crucial for me to show up for my team, and it's crucial for me to be here. And so her kind of just taking the reins on that and showed me how much she cared about me. And like, that was really huge. And I wouldn't say it was out of character for her, but it was the first time that I had really experienced just that depth of care that she had for her team. And that was just really, really beautiful and wonderful. And it just allowed me to kind of exhale and take some time, and then be able to come back as my, fully rested and ready to take on the rest of it. So it was a really wonderful moment of me being like, okay, it is okay to be vulnerable, and for her to kind of take the reins and say, you need to take some time. So go home and recover and come back when you're ready. And it was interesting because she, again, was very challenging in a lot of ways, but she just was able to have equal parts vision and ambition and hustle, and also care and consideration. And it was a really, really beautiful combination.
Yeah, and what a great story. So one part of that I'd love to pick up on, actually, because I think it's a practical thing, a practical lesson that any leader in the audience can take away from this, is when you said, I would never have asked for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something, especially in that sort of scenario, again, we're back to the responsibility of leaders, aren't we? Don't assume just because people aren't saying, I'm in trouble here, I need help, that they're not in trouble and need help. If you could go back in time to the start of your career, what advice would you give your younger self?
The biggest lesson that I wish I had learned earlier was like, to thine own self be true, right? Of you, if you're feeling things are wrong, if you're feeling that your morals are being compromised, if you're feeling like this isn't a good place, all of that intuition is there for a reason. And I think there was so long that I just put my own judgment to the side, because I thought that this is what you do, right? This is what you do in business, and and you have to make the hard calls sometimes. But there was so many times that I felt so compromised morally. So I think if I could go back, I would encourage myself to trust that voice a lot more, and to act on it, and to not let it go to the wayside for so long. Because I think we just compromise our integrity so often in business, definitely in toxic environments. And I think those are the things that really weigh on you a lot after the fact. Those are the things that you're like, I knew it was wrong, and I did it because I thought that I had to, or because, it needed to be done, or whatever it may be. So if I could go back, I would definitely work on that piece a little bit more, because I always knew, but I just never allowed myself to make different choices because I was people pleasing, or I wanted to succeed, or, and since I've stopped doing that, I have found not only am I the happiest I've ever been, but like I feel completely different about my work environment. I feel completely different about my profession. I feel completely different about my relationships, right? So I think that just that little voice and that intuition that we have is really, really powerful. And I think we need to give it autonomy a little bit more in our decisions that we're making.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm pleased to hear it as well. I think it's one of those things, isn't it, where if you don't trust yourself at the time to stick to what you know is right, then looking back, you'll stop trusting yourself at all, potentially.
Yes, definitely.
And it is, again, it's one of these really, I mean, it is interesting. It's also sort of distressing, isn't it? But these sort of foibles of human behavior, isn't it? About how easily, in the right circumstances, good people can do bad things. Now, I'm sure you didn't do particularly bad things, but, historically, more widely, toxic cultures are a great example of it because, there's so many sort of middle management people in there, I'm sure, who in any other situation would never do some of those things or talk to people in those ways or behave in that way. But because they have become a product of that culture, it doesn't even occur to them most of the time that what they're doing isn't the right thing because that's how it's done here. Must be the way we do it.
Definitely. Yeah. And one of my favorite kind of subgroups to work with are first time managers and people that are really, really new into the fields. Yeah.
You're in the right place.
Yeah. I love it because not only is there kind of a passion and a motivation there, but it's also, there's it's a delicate spot because I think young employees get socialized really, I wouldn't say easily, but I think I definitely had the experience of being really young in my career and getting socialized into a culture that, I was told this is how it's done. And I was told this is what it looks like. And it wasn't until I grew up a little bit and had more experience that I realized like, oh no, no, it's wrong. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it's not always that way. So I think I really love talking with young people that are very new into their jobs and new into their careers and really working with them to not just develop that intuition and to listen to that intuition, but also to get like the tools and the resources and the words to be able to express when things aren't right and to advocate for how to shift things, because I think that voice is really powerful. And I think young employees get socialized into, just like any other culture, right? We can get socialized into really harmful things, and undoing that down the road is a lot harder than just kind of setting people up for success in the first place.
Definitely. And there's the confidence aspect to it. There's the imposter syndrome elements as well. And at that early stage of a career, like, especially if you're new to an industry as well, not just to a company, like, you might look at it and think, well, that doesn't seem quite right, but maybe it's just the industry. Maybe there's something I don't know, would be the natural assumption. And then you'll also lack the confidence to question it anyway. And then before long, years have gone past and you don't realize what's happened.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's the scary part of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, well, there's definitely hope for the future, though, I'm sure.
Yes.
So last question I have for you, it's usually my favorite one as well. It's called Leadership Heroes.
Leadership Heroes.
So if you had to pick one person, it could be literally anyone you like, anyone you could think of, alive, dead, past, present, real, fictitious, if you want. But it has to be someone who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that person be and why?
I think if we're going real, my favorite leadership expert, guru, all of that is Simon Sinek, who's he's a leadership writer, right? And he writes about teams and motivation and everything. And so much of his work has really shaped my ideas of leadership. And I love that he's so innovative. He's so innovative in the way that he understands human behavior and the way that he's able to synthesize it for developing best practices for leaders. Like he's incredible. I absolutely love his work. And then I would also like to do a fictitious example. Yes. Yeah. Start With Why was the first one I read by him. Love it. And I think I've read like 4 of his books now. He's amazing. And every time he pops up on a video or a reel or anything, I just get so excited. Every time he talks, there's a piece of it for me that I'm like, oh yeah, that's really good. That clicks. He's amazing. And then fictitious, I am currently in the second season of Ted Lasso, and I love his leadership style. He's such a good leader. And it's so different, I think, than my set idea of what a leader is, right? He's so incredible in the way that he works with his team and the way that he talks to people, and again, that level of care, but like finding that balance of when to lead and then when to let people lead themselves, right? When to pull back and when to support, and then when to like step in and when people need more. And he's funny and it's quirky, and I know it's a scripted show, but it's so good. I love the leadership aspects in Ted Lasso. It's brilliant.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of those. Yeah, I mean, Ted Lasso is a weird show. Like, I shouldn't enjoy it because I absolutely hate that sport, like with a fiery passion. And yeah, it's just such a good show. And I think it's probably because, as you say, such a great example of leadership. Mm-hmm. And he reminds me of a couple of leaders I've encountered over the years who often in those really stressful environments, actually, and yet somehow they were able to just be the calm in the storm. And you knew you could just trust them. You could go to them if you got stuck or if you needed something, and they would have your back and they wouldn't like hold it against you in the future. And he just reminds me of that sort of real world leader. Yeah, it is such a good show.
And just that positivity, right? Just that power of that positivity, which I think is something that we don't think about in terms of a leader, right? But the way that I think calm is a great word for it, right? The way that, because he's so positive, because he's so uplifting, and there is just that level of calm, it's like people really can both relax, but then also level up and also show up at their best. It's like, you know that you're safe at your worst, so you can show up at your best. And it's a brilliant show. It's one of the best shows I've seen in, I don't know, years. And the writing is so good. And, but there's so many, I think, really applicable examples for great leadership, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's the way he delivers the positivity as well. Like, it's not just relentless, unrealistic optimism in your face, which is how a lot of people do it. Again, it's like understated and calm, but it's always there. Yeah, no, I mean, we could talk about this for ages, can we? I'm conscious you're only in the second season, so I don't want to spoil it for you. But yeah, it is definitely worth a watch. I think I read they're doing a new one, but that might have been a rumour.
Okay.
Saw it on the internet, so I never trust it.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Well, Kelsey, thank you for such a great conversation. We got into some really interesting and deep topics there. I love talking culture. I find it so fascinating and just confusing as well, to be honest, at times. And some great leadership lessons in there for everyone listening as well. So on that note, if anyone in the audience would like to learn more about you, maybe get in touch, work with your company, where can they go? How can they do that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much everywhere. So I do post on Instagram almost daily with leadership tips, advice, different snippets. So that is at @ByDesignConsulting_BDC. And then I'm on TikTok at @ByDesignConsulting. I'm on LinkedIn under Kelsey Neff. And then I also just released a book as well. So if people are interested more in just leadership and how I work with companies. So it's called 52 Weeks of Impact, a guidebook for your first year of leadership. So you can definitely check that out as well. And then in the back of the book are links to all of my socials and how to get in touch with me. So for first-time managers, I would love for you to pick that up. Hopefully it would be really helpful as you're navigating that first year, which is really tricky for new managers. So yeah, that's where you can find me. I'd love to connect with anybody that's interested.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll put a selection of those links in the episode description as well, so everyone can find it easily. And that's it. That's all we've got time for. Thank you again so much for your time. It's been great meeting you and really enjoyed our conversation today.
I did too. Thank you so much for having me, David.
Kelsey, thank you so much again for that conversation. Some big and important topics covered there, and I hope we did it in a useful and accessible way for the listeners and the viewers. Speaking of whom, if any of you would like to learn more about Kelsey and the work that she does, do check out the links in the episode description. Click on the thing, learn the stuff. And if you are new to leadership, or if you're in a key moment of change, transition within your leadership journey, do come along and join us at Integrity Leaders. Visit my website. The link is here somewhere on the screen around me. Don't know where exactly, but you'll also find it in the show notes. It's www.leadingwithintegrity.co.uk. Hit the green button on that homepage, take you to the sign up for the community. Before you do that, if you're not quite ready yet, feel free to explore the website. There's loads of resources on there, including a brand new leadership quiz, which will help you surface some of the biggest challenges that you might be suffering with as a leader right now. It will also help you identify an example or a potential leadership hero for you. So if you ever come on the podcast, you'll have a pre-made answer. So I recommend that quiz. There's also quarterly workshops that you can sign up for, a free PDF guide on leadership and how to take those first steps in the best ways, and loads more to read besides. So go and have a look. Let me know your feedback. My LinkedIn info is in the show notes as well. I'd love to hear from you. Drop me a message. Tell me what you think, and let me know your result on the quiz as well. Always interested to hear that. Well, that's all from me today. Join me again next month. In fact, we're doing a themed month on resilience, which is a bit of a hot topic in leadership and management and business as well right now. So we'll have 4 guests who'll be joining us to talk about that. First of which is Julian Roberts, who you may remember from his brief segment in our New Year special way back at the beginning of, well, actually, no, it was at the end of December, not the beginning of January. But anyway, it was our New Year special. So Julian Roberts, he is a resilience and leadership expert. We'll be talking all about his views and his experiences and why resilience is such an important issue for the modern manager. Not one to miss out on. Hope you'll be there. And until then, be a leader, not a boss.